Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think I'm going to be interviewing one of the only people who did an exam in Oxford this morning for his PhD. So if we can give Jeffrey a good shout out. He was going to be wearing his whole Oxford outfit, but he decided to wouldn't be appropriate for a tech conference. So I think Jeffrey's awesome. For those of you who don't know Jeffrey, he, a few months ago, started doing a translation of writing on AI in China and translating them into English and launched an email. And what was amazing about that is so many of us actually think we know about China, we read a lot about China, but we actually don't read anything in the Chinese language about what the real debates are around AI in China. So Jeffrey just decided to start a translation of those reports and those kind of conferences. And it's now taking off. So hopefully by the end of this meeting, you'll all be subscribing to Jeffrey's email. It is free, so I'm not trying to pump something here. So Jeffrey, I'd just like to know why you decided that was a good idea.
Yeah, I was realizing in the course of researching China's AI development, I was put in the final stages of a report on deciphering China's AI dream. And I realized I was repeating a lot of what the consensus was in the West, stuff like relatively lax privacy protections, no discussion of AI ethics in China. And some people pointed me towards, oh, go actually read some Chinese language documents. And so I found a book co-authored by Tencent and the Chinese government's China Academy of Information Communications Technology. And it was a 500-page book on everything from AI strategy, high-level, top-level plans, concerns about deep privacy concerns, substantive discussions of the AC Lomar AI principles. So I realized I had to change some of my initial assumptions, and I kind of, from there, started unpulling some of these threads and found there were so many of these platforms that were devoted to covering China AI issues every day. So just started picking up some of this low-hanging fruit and translating it.
So what do you think the West generally gets wrong about China?
Yeah, I would say that, and this was partly the way I started researching it too, was there's too much of an emphasis on government plans. So I started tracking, like, here's all the different government plans related to science and technology. Then I started realizing that this is the technology area where a lot of the big tech companies are leading the way. And there is such an emerging and thriving startup scene in this space that a lot of the times it's the government catching up to what the companies are doing and trying to ride the wave of what the companies are pushing forward.
So I'd be really interested in you talking about one of your reports. Obviously, I think a lot of us in this room will know that in the UK, we've launched plans to have about $1 billion spent on AI. Macron has announced plans to spend $1.5 billion. The Chinese have spent not just $2 billion on a new plan in Beijing, but they have plans to have a core industry of at least $150 billion. So I think most of us in this room probably know that data. What I didn't know is the scale of local support and local government support across China to help advocate and back AI. And alongside the $150 billion is another 429 billion plans across regional governments by 2020 to have that scale of industry. Can you just talk about what you've learned about the scale of support at the not just national level, but the regional level?
Yeah, I think this is another one of those key misconceptions that I had to work my way through as well, where the national plan that got all of the attention in July 2017 by the State Council, by then, Tianjin, which is a city in China, had already set up their own AI development fund, and many cities had already set their own local benchmarks. Then after the national plan kind of sent this signal that China's government was all in on AI, you had a bunch of local governments following up. And I kind of added up the total of all of those local plans, as Caroline just mentioned. And the national plan set the benchmark of a 150 billion RMB core AI industry by 2020. Now, the definition of core, the scale of the core AI industry is kind of malleable and hard to determine. What you can view that figure as is a gross output figure of companies involved in industry-agnostic AI development, so technologies that translate across industries. And the local government figure, combining all of those, was 429 billion RMB. So it kind of shows how the national government sent the signal, and then local governments took it and went even farther, and just a demonstration of how much hype there is around AI in China.
And talk about the hype in China. Obviously, another big myth about China or probably reality, is around data and privacy.
Yep.
We've heard a lot about that. It's a sort of go-to sort of fact about that the Chinese tech companies are allowed to do whatever they like with data and compare with the Western companies, and therefore they have a comparative advantage.
Yep.
What's the truth about that?
Well, there is some truth to that. So some companies, especially in facial recognition area, like SenseTime, MegV, Face++, they have benefited from access to government databases on, people's faces and identities and surveillance camera footage across provinces. So there's a lot more data pooling across provinces on those fronts. So there are benefits from more access to data and more lax privacy standards. But the scene on privacy is changing. So what I would say is, while there's not as much of a rule of law system in terms of a clear privacy standard, there are pretty clear push and pull dynamics. So companies can only push too far before there's a pullback by the public or the government. So Qihoo 360 had a streaming platform where they basically broadcast footage from schools and just to the public. And there was a big public outcry when this was revealed, and it got shut down. Now, the fact that it was allowed to be broadcast in the first place is kind of revealing. But it does show that there are these pullback dynamics. And you're seeing that with emerging standards in the law space as well, with a new personal information standard.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the personal information standard could be seen as like follow-up to some of the things that happened with the cybersecurity law, which basically cracks down on a couple of elements, one of which is selling of personal information to third parties without getting express user consent. So there are, and some analysts, like one from CSIS by the name of Sam Sachs, described some of the language in this law as even more far-reaching than the GDPR. Now, a lot of this will be hammered out in the implementation details. It's easy to put flowery rhetoric into policy guidance documents, but I think it is reflective of some of the emerging conversations that are happening.
Yeah, in fact, there was a piece in The Economist which came out, I think, today, and it was talking about data and privacy in China, and gave a great example of a guy who had been talking on his phone about how he liked picking strawberries. And the next morning he went online, and his news aggregator, all the news was about strawberry-related stories. I don't know how many strawberry stories there are out there, but apparently they were all, and he freaked out about it, and he did a post which went viral in China about this. So I think it was interesting looking at how far it's led by consumers being concerned about online privacy, and it's coming naturally out of the fact that so much is happening online. Yeah,
a lot of it is there's connections to be drawn towards broader issues of governance where the state is very concerned about performance legitimacy and responding to sort of things that could spiral into collective demands or collective resistance. So a very interesting example is there's a big case. This is kind of a different tint than the strawberry example, which is a little bit more benign, but this one was with the kindergarten, the red, blue, yellow kindergarten in China. And this kindergarten there's a child abuse scandal where this kindergarten teachers were using pinpricks to harm students and giving them medical pills. And these all came to light. But the key word that inspired the most debate was one of the teachers had told the children that they had a long-range telescope that could peer into every child's home so they couldn't tell their parents. And it was this type of idea of the long-range telescope that when you look at Baidu trends or search trends, this was the phrase that attracted more attention than even the pinpricks and the pills. This idea that the school had this long-range telescope into people's homes. So I think the key takeaway here is it's not that Chinese people do not care about privacy. It's just that there are different circumstances that shape what privacy with Chinese characteristics means. And we have to do a better job of understanding that.
And just to stick with the sort of surveillance idea, again, The Economist a while ago had a great piece, and it noted that China now has 176 million surveillance cameras domestically, increasing at 13% annually, compared with the growth rate of 2% in the rest of the world.
Right.
So although it's surprising in the West that China is allowing that level of surveillance, and obviously you've got companies like SenseTime, which is now valued at $4.5 billion, which has access. It's both working with corporates and also working extremely closely with the state.
Right.
So how do those kinds of risks play out? Because that relationship between the state is quite different with some of the big Chinese tech companies.
Yeah. I think the surveillance camera number is interesting. The context for some of that, though, is that China just has less surveillance cameras than the US right now. So some of that is a catch-up, but you're right that growth rate is pretty stark. Maybe one good example of this is in Xinjiang, where some analysts have called it the testing ground for where China is implementing a lot of their surveillance apparatus. There's been some news stories recently about political re-education camps in Xinjiang. It's an area where there's high minority population and there's been some violence in the past, and that's where some of the more expansive applications of facial recognition, monitoring of people's social media for risks of dissent are happening. And since time, actually, for one of the issues of the newsletter, I found kind of a report from a security expo in Xinjiang where SenseTime made their debut, and they are technically a partner, a technical support partner with the Xinjiang Computer Vision Security Lab. So it shows that some of these companies, while we think of them as very international facing, very maybe like Western companies, there are also other sides to what these companies do with the government.
So we know a lot about China's ambitions, at least what they've said. How far, if you're looking at the debates in China, how far behind do they feel that they are? And who are they looking to and in the rest of the world?
Yeah, it's funny because when the State Council released the July 2017 plan, everyone in the West freaked out and was like, China has a plan to rule the world in AI. But actually, as I was going through some of the strategic documents from this Tencent book I mentioned earlier, one of the chapters was saying that actually Chinese leaders viewed them as falling behind in setting these AI development plans, and that other countries like the US and the UK had already issued strategic national level documents on this issue. So it is kind of an interesting case of misperception of both sides feeling they're behind and needing to push forward. I will say the AlphaGo moment in March 2016 was a big turning point as well, where especially in the public, there was this realization of the power of AI, and that started a lot of the hype that we're seeing.
Yeah, and in one of Jeffrey's emails, he noted that there was a massive increase in searches on Baidu around AlphaGo, but also obviously it sparks huge concerns in your report about in the Chinese military.
Yep.
And I'd love to hear from you about this, because apparently there was a symposium or a workshop on AlphaGo with the title AlphaGo and the intelligentization, I can't even say of military command and decision making. So they perceived it as a Sputnik moment of some kind, that suddenly AlphaGo was happening and it's something that they were getting behind.
Yeah.
What's that done in terms of the kind of the relationship with the AI and military, which again is something you look at quite closely?
Yeah. So this is not exactly my area of expertise, but people at Center for New American Security, Elsa Kanya, she pointed me towards this workshop that happened right after AlphaGo. And it just so happens that Go has a long history of being a strategic game, especially in Chinese military culture. So you see some People's Liberation Army leaders who actually hold a dual position as the head of the Go Association. So that's something that I've noticed is there is that connection, and it just happened to be that Go is a game that's pretty central to military dynamics. So the intelligentization of warfare.
You said it much better than me.
There's intelligentization of warfare. There's informatization of warfare, but it points to kind of competition, not necessarily in the form of a specific AI weapon, which I think is what we gravitate to, but I see more of the emerging lines of conflict around how do militaries organize information better. So the distinction in history is kind of a lot of people viewed the US's victory over Iraq in the Persian Gulf War as a victory of precision weapons and just stealth technology. Other people argue that it was more about how these technologies were organized together. And they point to other revolutions of warfare, such as in World War I, World War II, where there's better organization of artillery. And so AI kind of like may propel forms of systems warfare, where you have Navy ships operating as one organism. And that might be a more tangible area of military conflict between US and China in areas like the South China Sea or the Pacific.
Are we in an arms race with China around AI?
Yeah, I'm very hesitant to use the word arms race just because I think it's a little bit almost insulting to the types of arms races we've had in the past, where I see arms races as very much almost wasteful expenses on narrow technologies that have no use aside from propelling states in a security dilemma and like kind of creating these escalating dynamics. And I don't see that with AI. Kind of the stuff that I'm talking about with military improvements are very much, some of these will be just efficiency improvements, like stuff that Palantir is doing with the US military. Some of these will just be like how you're organizing your military. So I hesitate to use the word arms race just because it connotes this idea of extremely wasteful spending for notions of deterrence and security dilemma. Whereas here you have a technology that you're not, the spending isn't really going to waste because it's so general purpose.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be more precise with our language on that front.
Talking about sort of long-term ambitions of China,
Yeah.
one thing which I think is really interesting is how the role that they're now playing in thinking ahead about setting technical standards in
Yeah.
AI. And I used to be a tech correspondent at the Financial Times,
Yeah.
and when I stopped being a tech correspondent, I was told the things I should really have been looking at is who's in the room setting the technical standards, because that defines the future success in many areas of technology. So I've always learned from that, and I'd love to hear from you about how far China is obviously being super aware of needing to be in that room. And again, in one of your reports, you noted that the chair, senior director of Huawei,
Right.
is now chair of a new committee setting standards in AI. Can you just talk a bit about, map that field and what we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, there's a saying in China where it's third-tier companies make products, second-tier companies make platforms, first-tier companies make standards. So that goes to this idea of who is setting the rules with these strategic technologies. And China and Chinese decision makers kind of have this thinking that they missed the boat on internet technologies, and now AI is this new domain where their companies can be the ones setting the technical standards that will govern market access for AI products as these companies try to be the best in the world, not just the best in China. So you're exactly right on that front. I've been looking at this new subcommittee of the ISO/IEC, which are two important acronyms in the technical standards space. These two international standards bodies set 85% of product standards, and they have a new committee on AI. And there's a big conflict, or not. There was some degree of competition between the U.S. and China over who would be the secretariat of that committee, because the secretariat gets to do all of the coordination. These international standards bodies have to devolve a lot of kind of decision-making power to these secretariats because the standards bodies themselves don't have much technical expertise. So the US ended up getting the secretariat role, but what I think was the compromise was the first meeting happened in April in Beijing this year. So China got to be kind of the convening role. And as you mentioned, Wael Diab is the senior director of Huawei, and he's the chair of the committee, which is more of a ceremonial role. The secretary is the position to watch out for. So I've been translating the white paper that came out of China in preparation for that meeting. It's a lot of jargon, but you're right. These are the things that are happening behind closed doors where, the future protocols are being set.
So when China looks at that, where is Europe in this debate? I mean, obviously, you're talking a lot about China and the US relationship, but where do in the policy-making community, how do they see the kind of European story? Are we over-obsessed by ethics in Europe versus sort of being more ambitious on behalf of Europe? What's the kind of tone of the debate that you're picking up? Yeah,
I think Chinese decision makers and leaders see the UK, Europe as an ethical leader of sorts. That's been in some of the documents I've been translating. I think Europe, in general, has a pretty large role to play in technical standards. There's a professor at Oxford by the name of Walter Matley who kind of looks at financial standards and product standards and shows in various domains that European technical standards bodies like the British Standards Institute that's doing stuff on that's also doing stuff in this domain. They have a lot of influence in setting what the right protocols are, and I think you see with the EU GDPR kind of an effort to, like a lot of these decisions about privacy will have a lot of implications about what type of products will be the best going forward. If you have an AI product that uses federated learning and trains data locally without having to upload it to a cloud where there's more risks of user data being stolen, maybe a future technical standard will mandate that federated learning has to be the key that has to be embedded within your products. So these things really matter. It's hard to it's hard to turn something that's unsexy like technical standards into something that's really meaningful. I'm trying to do that with my research, so I'm still figuring out how to do that.
So let's just, we have just 1 minute left. What kind of innovations are you excited about that we're seeing coming out of China right now? Where do you think that they're really cutting edge and leading?
Yeah, I think facial recognition obviously is one area where they're just pushing ahead in terms of applications. Voice recognition, I think Baidu's Duer OS virtual assistant is another space that's really interesting. I think those would be the three that come to mind. Obviously, self-driving cars. There's a funny saying that Baidu's self-driving car department, if you work in that department, you can start your own startup and just get $100 million in capital and funding. So many people have left that department and started their own self-driving car startups. So that's another exciting space.
So just to sort of, again, to wrap up, looking at sort of data and privacy issues, what concerns you most about China based on what you're reading?
Yeah, I think that while a lot of the hype about the social credit system is something that we in the West kind of push on our worst fears on China, we kind of look at China through a glass, like a dark glass, and we kind of get to play out some of our fears by talking about China. I think there are some serious things to be concerned about in that respect. Serious concerns about where are the limits to public and private spaces when you have facial recognition being deployed in schools that are scanning the emotions of children. This is being piloted at Hangzhou No. 11 High School. Serious concerns about the applications of AI in oppressive tactics against dissidents. And then kind of the slower, more subtle issues of what happens when all of our behavior is being inputted into an algorithm. And what does that say about people-to-people relations? I think these are some of the deeper questions that China is going to be at the center of. So definitely a place to watch and a place to learn from.
Well, I think if that hasn't persuaded you to subscribe to Jeffrey's email, I don't know what will. I'd just like to ask you to join me in thanking Jeffrey for his insights and for translating stuff that we can all read. Thank you very much.